Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology 303, Analysis of Everyday Behavior. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about behavioral skills training. So over the last few weeks we've talked about some techniques that we can use to help people start to behave in ways that they hadn't before, ways that they can acquire new behaviors, such as prompting and fading, such as shaping. But today we're going to talk about a new technique, a new type of training or a new intervention that we can use that many people, when they want to learn a new skill, a new behavior, then they go through this type of behavioral skills training. So examples of this would be an individual who maybe wants to be more assertive in their life, more assertive in the workplace, want to be actually stand up to people who are bullying them. Well, they might go to a training session, maybe with other people that can give them the tools and the skills they need to be more assertive in their own life. Or maybe you have parents who want to make sure that their children are safe, so they send their children to a type of training that helps them prevent abductions from occurring. Or a self-defense class is another great example of this type of behavioral skills training. And what's exactly happening in BST, is what it's abbreviated as, BST, are these procedures, these sets of behaviors, sets of skills, are taught in a training session. It's extremely helpful to go through one of these training sessions because you have at least one person teaching a bunch of other people, or it could be one person, oftentimes a complex set of skills. Teaching them how to use these skills, how to perform these behaviors, when to use them, how to use them in the appropriate circumstances. And oftentimes these behaviors are simulated in this training session, so people can get accustomed to actually performing these behaviors. Now granted, these are happening within a training session and oftentimes a separate location, so they're not actually getting that real world experience, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But what are the key components of behavioral skills training? Well, first we have instructions. This is when the teacher describes exactly what the skills or the behaviors are, hopefully identifying any behavioral chains that are occurring, if there's kind of a sequence to the behaviors, when to perform the when to perform the behaviors, when not to perform the behaviors. So in a certain extent, identifying discriminative stimuli and identifying the consequences of the behaviors. All right. Especially in a self-defense class, all right, if you perform this specific behavior, what's the certain area that you should be attacking? When should you use this? What's the sequence of moves that you should use? And what is going to end up hurting on the other person? All this information is really helpful. Ideally, the learner should repeat back the instructions to the teacher, so that way the teacher knows that they are paying attention. After instructions, we then transition into modeling. This is when the teacher actually performs the behaviors that they want the learners to acquire. Demonstrate the behavior. Ideally, you want the learner to obviously observe what the teacher is modeling, those specific behaviors, but you also want them to imitate the behaviors. They need to demonstrate what's known as an imitative repertoire, that they have the ability to perform these behaviors as well. Modeling can be in person, live modeling, or it can be via some other medium, oftentimes video. That would be a symbolic modeling example. The behavior should be appropriately complex so that they need to actually watch what's happening. If you have a very simple behavior, you don't actually need to model it. You can just give verbal instructions. And ideally, it should appear, or it should be modeled rather, in the appropriate context. So say, for example, if you have a self-defense class, you might want to perform this on a dummy or some other person, some other teacher, so you can see exactly how it should be administered. Again, you want to make sure the learners are paying attention. You want to reinforce any examples of imitating the modeling appropriately. And ideally, what you want is you want the teacher to be higher status than the learners. So that way, not only are the learners going to pay more attention to the teacher, but they are also going to believe them a lot more frequently. They're going to be more willing to put forth effort and actually try and imitate this behavior correctly. So part of imitating is what's known as rehearsal. This is when the learner practices the appropriate behavior, imitates what they've just viewed in terms of the modeling, It should occur directly after the directions, instructions, or modeling are given. You want people to rehearse the easy behaviors first and then transition into the more complex behaviors. And again, this should all be occurring within the proper context. Good examples of rehearsal of the behavior itself should be reinforced. And in performing rehearsal, the teacher also gets a pretty good idea of whether or not people are understanding the directions that are being given, if they're understanding the exact modeling that they're using. If not, then the teacher can try and use a different technique. Lastly, we have feedback. And this is, yes, the end point, but it can also be the beginning point for a whole other cycle. So feedback should occur immediately after rehearsal, telling people whether or not they are performing this behavior correctly. Praise should be delivered if the behavior is indeed being performed correctly. If it isn't, then further instructions or further modeling should be used. Ideally, you want to always include praise in some way, shape, or form. You want to rehearse the fact that people are even trying to perform this behavior, and then follow that up with the instructions on what aspects of the behavior to choose. And as I mentioned, the feedback is great because it's that endpoint if the person is performing the behavior correctly, but it also can transition into new instructions, new modeling, a new rehearsal if the person isn't quite right there in terms of what they should be doing. So again, if we want to use the self-defense training as an example, a teacher would demonstrate a specific move that they would use. The teacher would then model that behavior, and then everyone else in the room would practice that behavior that they've been instructed to perform, that they've modeled. And then afterwards, the teacher would provide feedback as a group maybe, or if they're walking around the room, would deliver that feedback at a kind of one-on-one level. So there are some important things to consider when implementing behavioral skills training. We'll kind of go through these one by one. First is that along with all these other techniques that we've talked about, we want to enhance generalization as much as possible. We'll talk about that in the next video in a little bit more detail. But especially within behavioral skills training, role-playing is great. Trying to incorporate aspects of real life into the training itself. So maybe training in the actual location where the person would use this technique. Maybe using training in self-defense in a park where people are more likely to be attacked, for example. And then to also encourage people to practice these skills, these behaviors outside of training, and then try to figure out if there's ways that you could reinforce those attempts as well. Again, try to encourage the behavior to occur more often. Ideally, you also want to assess whether or not the training is effective. Again, learning the skills is different from using them. You can go to school, you can learn all the information, but unless you're actually able to apply that information in the appropriate situations, it's not really going to be that helpful. So you want to assess how well the person has learned the behavior in a different context than training. Ideally, you don't want the presence of the teacher to be a discriminative stimulus for the presence of the behavior. You want the behavior to occur when the situation is appropriate. So you would use what is known as in situ assessment. That's when you assess those specific skills or behaviors in the appropriate environment, oftentimes without the awareness of the learner. Again, oftentimes in a situation that is different from training. If you perform this type of assessment and you realize, oh, okay, they're not actually performing the behavior correctly, you would shift immediately into in situ training. And that's when you give new instructions, use new modeling, in order to try and help the person rehearse the correct behavior in the correct context in multiple situations. A great example of this would be in using medical procedures. Again, you're teaching these med students how to perform these specific types of procedures. They might know it front to back from a textbook, but when they're actually in that situation, they may lock up. So in that situation, you would talk them through it, show them what to do, have them rehearse the behavior before they actually try and perform it in the situation. So assessment is important. And again, we can think back to the 3-term contingency that we've talked about throughout the quarter, the antecedent, behavior, and consequence of a specific target behavior. In this situation with BST, the antecedent are the instructions and modeling. Those should increase the likelihood of the behavior occurring. That's when we rehearse that behavior. And then the consequence of that behavior should be some kind of feedback. Am I doing it correctly? Am I doing it correctly? And feedback in itself, again, should lead to further behaviors, giving new instructions, new modeling, etc. Lastly, at least the examples I've been using with BST have been focusing on group training, and that is extremely common within BST. Group training is extremely effective and a great way to teach a lot of people the same skill at the same time. It's a lot more efficient. There are more models to observe. Not only are you observing the teacher, but you're also observing everyone else who's learning that same behavior. You have a lot of sources of feedback. You're more likely to generalize because you're not only tying the behavior to the specific teacher, but you're tying it to a bunch of other people. But you might not get the individual attention you need if you're really struggling with learning that behavior. For that reason, BST is most effective in smaller groups. Yes, more people is great, but you do want to get that mix of using other people as tools, basically, as new models, but you also want to be able to have individual time with the teacher to make sure that you're on the right track learning that specific behavior. So in terms of the procedure, again, you want to identify and define the appropriate behaviors or skills that you want. You want to identify all of the relevant discriminative stimuli. When is it that you want this behavior to occur and not occur? You need to assess, all right, what's the most effective training that I need to use to help this person learn the behavior? Is it just going to be instructions? Do I need to use different types of modeling? You then want to follow through with those. Allow the people time to rehearse the behavior, provide feedback on those behaviors, and then repeat this kind of cycle, those 4 steps, until the learner is able to execute this behavior multiple times without any help. Then, and only then, do you want to try and generalize as much as possible. So that way the people are performing the behaviors in the appropriate circumstances and they don't seem to get frazzled when it occurs. All right, so that's all I have for behavioral skills training. Thank you all for your time and attention, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.